All right, we got everybody here. How's it going?
All right.
Excited to chat a little bit about your book today.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be here. This is my first time doing one of these live ones.
Cool. Yeah, no, we've done a couple of these, but this is a bit of a newer format for us here at Fishbowl. So, we're excited to have you sort of talk about your book. And I guess how's the launch been going?
I think it's been going well. It's my first time doing it, so you know, I've never written a book or launched a book before, but I think it's going all right. I've got 2 reviews on Amazon, so I guess it could be
All right. Well, I guess you can measure this. You know how to measure the success of this conversation. Maybe, hopefully, you'll get a few more reviews on Amazon tonight.
going.
Cool. So what we'll do is we'll just wait another minute or two to get going. Allow folks on Fishbowl to join us here. But for the folks who are joining us right now, you are participating in a Fishbowl Live, and we have a really impressive panel tonight. We've got Jeff Lawson, the CEO of Twilio. We've got Erin Teague, the Director of Product Management at YouTube, and Namrata Ganatra, who is the former CTO at Lambda School. And these are all really, smart people, and I'm excited to hear their perspective on things. But we're going to be talking about Jeff Lawson's book, and his book is called "Ask Your Developer." And it's about how to harness the power of software developers to win in the 21st century. So we have some really experienced tech and product leaders joining us tonight for a cool conversation. We'll invite some of you all up to ask some questions and dive in from there. I think this might be a good time for us to have each of you introduce yourselves. So, Jeff, since you're the man of the hour, I'll pass the mic over to you. Um, can you please tell us, a little bit about yourself, what Twilio does, and why you wanted to write a book about software development? And then we'll go to Erin. Tell us, what you do at YouTube and what your perspective is on product management, and then we'll go to Namrata and dive in.
Sure, Sam. I think with that lead in, I could probably just talk for the whole hour, but I will make it quick. So I'm a software developer. I'm a serial entrepreneur. Started multiple companies before Twilio. 2 of them you've probably never heard of. One of them I was the first CTO of StubHub. And started Twilio to let every developer in the world have communications as a core part of their toolkit so that they could build amazing customer engagement into the wide variety of applications that developers are now tasked with building for companies in order that let them compete in the digital era. And like, I'm pretty sure that the folks listening in on this group understand the nature of how you need to build software experiences in order to win in this economy. And the thing that I've noticed is that so many companies and so many executives don't really know how to work with software developers and their technical teams in order to find success. And there's just a lot of we use different terms. Like business people, we say certain things, technical people say other things. And as a developer turned CEO, now running a public company, like I have my feet in both worlds. And so I thought that the book would be really useful to help create a common parlance and to kind of build a bridge between the world of business and the world of tech people and developers and the process of building great software to try to create more understanding by the business people of like what's going on in their software development teams. How does that whole world work? And how do you actually partner with developers and unleash that technical talent to go really create amazing, like game-changing products and experiences that help companies become great digital executors in this digital economy?
Wow, I think you should win an award, Jeff, for packing in so much detail and a succinct answer. We're really pleased to have you here, and I think that's a great segue to Erin, who really understands how to bridge the gap between business people and developers and the more technically oriented members of an organization as the director of product management at YouTube. So, Erin, I'll let you sort of introduce yourself.
Yes, hello. Thanks, Sam. And hi, everyone. I am Erin Teague. I lead product, or I'm the director of product, and I lead across a couple of different product areas at YouTube, including sports, including a brand new subscription business, which I can't tell you much about because we haven't yet launched, and a couple other areas, including actually our racial justice initiative. And so I've been at YouTube for about 4 years now, but my entire career has been in tech. And as Sam mentioned, super passionate about this space because by training, I studied software engineering, computer science, and computer engineering in college. I worked as a software developer and software engineer, and then I actually went to business school. So I have an MBA degree as well, and then use that to kind of transition into product. So having kind of lived both worlds as a business person with an MBA, but at the end of the day, I still consider myself more of an engineer than anything else, and can certainly relate to what Jeff mentioned in terms of how these two different groups speak two very different languages and operate very differently. So excited to dig in and have a bunch of questions for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Erin. And last but definitely not least, we have Namrata, Namrata Ganatra. And I'll let you introduce yourself and a little bit about your background.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Sam. Hey, everyone. I'm Namrata. I'm currently bootstrapping my own startup. So perfectly in the world where I'm an executive, but a software engineer at heart. And most recently, I was a CTO at Lambda School. And prior to that, I've been product and engineering executive at a number of companies in the Valley, including Coinbase, Facebook, PayPal, and Microsoft, and a bunch of other startups. And on this side, I'm also working on authoring a book on diversity and inclusion in tech. So if any of you are interested in that, just hit me up offline. But I'm really excited for this conversation just because I'm right now in the middle of being a business executive and a software engineer. So the topic is really exciting to me. And Jeff, I have so many questions for you.
Awesome, Namrata. Thanks for that. So why don't we have you fire away with the first question?
Yeah, I guess my first question is, Jeff, for you, is that you and I both are engineers. We understand the importance of software development. So my question is, but how can a non-technical founder think about harnessing the power of software development to succeed?
Thank you. Great question, Namrata. And this book is actually written for non-technical people. It's written for the business executives who aren't that technical, but are trying to figure out, how do I interface with the developers that I work with, and how do I build a successful partnership? And I actually think the best way that I have found, actually, it starts with the idea that software developers are actually a pretty creative group of people. Software developers are, by and large, creative problem solvers. And the problem is that most people don't necessarily think of developers that way. They think of them sort of as math geeks who are more comfortable with a quadratic equation than with another human being. And the media reinforces this, right? Like, you think about Steve Urkel, or my favorite, Dennis Nedry from Jurassic Park, like the guy like rolling around in the mud about to get eaten by the dinosaur. It's like, that's what you think of when you think of a developer. But in fact, we should really think of developers as creative problem solvers. In fact, many developers, like, we did a survey, it was like 2/3 of developers like play musical instruments or have a creative hobby of painting or something like that. Like, developers are incredibly creative people. And so what you need to do is to think of them as partners who can apply that creativity to solving not just technical problems of, like, what should the code do, or how should the code work, but actually solving business problems and problems for your customers. And so the biggest piece of advice that I give to folks, one of the big pieces of advice from the book is share problems with your technical teams, not solutions. In many companies, the way it works is, like, you've got product managers or other business folks who their job, they see it as, is to go figure out what they should do for the customer, write it down in a specification, like a product requirements document or something like that, and then throw it over the wall to the developers to implement it. And that's what I would call sharing a solution with the developers. It's like someone else's job to go figure out how we're going to solve this problem and write a technical spec, and then hand it to the developers to like dutifully just write the code. And in fact, the better way to do it is to share the problem. So go to your technical team, or go to like, have a small team, and go to them and say, here's the problem we're trying to solve. Here's the business problem we're trying to solve. We're trying to, make it so people can sign up for our service in 30 seconds, not 10 minutes, like it currently does. Or we're trying to, increase cash flow, or we're trying to, like, whatever the problem is you're trying to solve, bring that problem to the technical team and unleash that creative problem solving part of the developers' minds to come up with new solutions. And when you do that, I think a bunch of things happen. First of all, you're going to find solutions that hadn't been thought of if you didn't bring the developers in. Partially because it's just more people and different ways of thinking, but partially because the developers often know the way the code is currently written. They know the architecture of the system, and they can see it in a different light. The second thing is you'll get better software written. Because if developers really understand the customer they're writing a product for and understand the problem you're solving, there's little details that get implemented just intrinsically because they understand why they're writing the software, that if they're just writing it to a spec, they will dutifully write it to the spec. They won't actually think of all those things because they don't actually know or care about what problem they're solving with that code. And then the last thing is, I think you get software built more quickly because the developers can actually think about, here's the solution as it exists today, and here's the problem we're trying to solve. I can figure out the shortest path from here to there. But if you give me a spec that says I have to walk 10 miles over there and 10 miles over there and 10 miles over there, it's like, well, I have to follow the prescribed path in the specification, whereas a developer can often plot a better route knowing how the technology actually works.
Yeah, I totally agree with you in terms of giving the problems, not the solution, to the developers. I guess my follow-up question to that, Jeff, is how can the teams leverage product managers effectively in that case, right? Because usually the instinct is to go to product manager with a problem, and then the product manager writes the spec and gives it to the developer.
Well, I think that, look, it's totally natural that as companies grow, there's all these divisions that arise in the company that actually end up insulating developers and the teams who are actually like building the product, insulating those people from the customer. And you have to fight that. I think back to the early days of Twilio, when in any given day, I might have like written some code, done like a pre-sales call with a customer or prospect, might have done some customer support tickets, talked to an investor, like you kind of are able to hold the whole thing in your head, and you're very quickly able to put the pieces together. And then as a company grows, you start siloing things out, and it's all done with really good intentions. Like you staff a customer support team who's there to answer the tickets, and you staff a sales team who's there to do the sales cycles, and sales engineers who are there to answer the technical questions. Also, you don't have to bring like the core engineers in all those various conversations, and that's all well and good, except those walls are preventing your developers, like the people building the product, from actually interacting with customers, and therefore building that intrinsic understanding of what customers need. And here's the thing about product managers. Product managers often see their role as protecting their team from the annoyance that is customers. And when you say it that way, it sounds pretty ridiculous, but that is the reality of how a lot of product managers see their role. Whereas I think great product managers actually see their role as facilitating the right interactions between customers and their team to help the team understand customers better. And I think that's the way product managers can use their role, use their position, and use their skills in order to help bring the team along with them in really understanding the problem and the customer, as opposed to seeing their role as guarding the team, like being the API that sits between the business and the technical people, see themselves as the facilitators of making sure their whole team understands the problem. And I love, there's a favorite story that I shared in the book of this guy, Ben, who's actually a product leader at Twilio, who was straight out of college. His first job was he was an engineer. He was a developer at Bloomberg. And he shows up like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed straight out of college at Bloomberg, like writing software for the Bloomberg terminals, like the traders use. And he showed up and he said, one of his first questions to the manager is like, when do we get to see one of the traders and like meet one of the customers who's using our software? And the product manager kind of laughs, is like, oh, that's funny. We've never done that, right? And Ben was like, oh, I just would have thought that that's what you do. Okay, I guess not. And he actually found a friend of his who was a trader and said, do you mind if I come by? I'm curious to see how our software is used. So Ben goes to the trading floor of one of these banks, and what he sees is they had always imagined, like when they're building this product, they had imagined that the traders used their little widget with some charts and graphs and whatever, and it was like the full like 30-inch screen was this giant thing of their widget. Well, when he showed up at the trading floor, what he actually saw was that his widget was like a 16 pixel by 16 pixel thing in this giant maze of all those different windows those traders look at, and it was completely illegible. Like the fonts didn't make sense, you couldn't read the chart, like none of it was as they imagined their customers were using it. And that insight, he came back and was like, wow, we got to completely rethink about how we do our font rendering and how we do our charts, all this kind of stuff. And that insight only came because he saw how the product was actually used in the field as opposed to the theoretical that they were developing under.
So I think that the director of product at YouTube is going to have some opinions here about the role of a product manager in the development organization.
Yeah. No, look, I think Jeff's characterization is dead on. It's obviously I also view product managers' role. The best product managers are facilitators, or to use a sports analogy, if you're a basketball fan, I view my role as the point guard, or if you're a football fan, I view my role as the quarterback. And then, the extent to which I'm good is really like, am I teeing up the right people for the right conversations at the right times? And so I actually think that that's the skill. And so, Jeff, I think, if I kind of had to throw this back to you, maybe just getting a bit more pedantic here. How would you advise product managers or just business people as a whole to really kind of thoughtfully tee up the right kinds of conversations for developers and engineers? Like, do you have a framework or a way to really think about when is the right time, and how to frequently get and unlock engineers and developers in terms of bringing them into some of these problems that need to be solved so that you can really tap into their creative juices at the right time and in the right scenarios? Like, what's your framework and thought process there?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I would say there isn't like necessarily one way that I've thought about it. It's come about in different ways in the past, and a lot of it's been modeled on a relationship that I had with my co-founder at my previous company. So before starting Twilio, I started a bricks and mortar retailer for extreme sporting goods like skateboarding, snowboarding, surfing, all that stuff, which is kind of a bizarre thing for me to do because I don't do any of those sports. But I thought that it was a really interesting technical opportunity to like figure out what technology would you use to like build an amazing retail experience. And this is back in like 2004, 2003 timeframe. And the interesting thing about my co-founder is that he was extremely non-technical. And in some ways, this is easier to do when you're non-technical. In fact, when I first met him, his name was Matt. He was like a technophobe. Like he didn't even want a laptop. He was like, I don't need a laptop. I was like, what are you talking about? That's all you use to do work these days. I was like, what are you going to do? Like just call everybody? I don't know. It was bizarre. But he was basically, he was not he was a technophobe, and therefore he didn't pretend to have answers for like how to solve a particular problem. And he didn't even know if a lot of these problems were solvable, but he would come to me when he was trying to figure out a business problem. Now, I'll give you an example. We had this retail store, and one day he was trying to figure out how to get the store managers to actually care about getting the salespeople to actually greet customers and like help them at the door. And he said, well, if we do a good job of greeting customers, we'll convert more of them into buyers. And so is there a way I can figure out my conversion rate of like people who walk in the front door to people who actually end up buying something? And he came to me with that question. Very simply, he's like, is there some way that we can figure out how to put that number in front of our store managers on like an hourly basis so that they actually feel motivated to make sure our salespeople actually greet people? And I was like, huh, that's a really interesting problem. I can understand why that's useful. I can understand why, showing that number to sales to the managers would change their behaviors. Well, let me think about it. And I realized, like, okay, there's those people counter devices that go at the doors. They like count how many people walk through when you break the beam of light. And I was like, okay, I'm going to see if those things have APIs. And then I pulled the data out of our point of sale system to figure out how many unique customers. And basically within a week, I had figured out how to like install these door counters, figure out how many people walk through the door, pull the data, take it from our point of sale, do the math, put that number in front of the managers on a real-time basis. And it's like, this is not a problem that I ever would have thought was interesting or Like, thought it never crossed my mind about how do those people counters work. But because he phrased it in that way, he shared a problem with me. And he didn't pretend to have the answer of how it ought to work or like didn't prescribe, hey, we need 6 people counters. We need blah, blah. He just said, here's this business problem I'm trying to solve. Can you think of anything? And I got to work and like basically had it up and running in a week. And that is like the essence, I think, of sharing problems. And so if I was like a product manager, the first thing I would do, hopefully you're in an environment where you've got small teams, because I think small teams are actually at the core. When you work on a team with like, if the team is too big, people end up getting removed from customers. You're not close to the customer, and you don't have a great sense of like purpose. And so it starts with having a small team. And I usually think of small teams as like 10 people or less. And that team is focused around the customer, a mission for why you're serving that customer, like the problem you're solving for them, in the fullness of time. And then the metrics of like, how do you know if you're actually doing a good job of serving that customer? And then within that framework, first of all, everyone on the team should be really closely connected to that mission. Like, it's not like a company mission where I get like company missions are kind of really big, they're kind of abstract, and everyone's like, yeah, I kind of get it, but it's not exactly connected to what I do every day. In this small team environment, like everyone shows up to work every day with a clear sense of the customer and why their team exists. So it starts there. That's like the long version of sharing the problem, right? And then on a day-to-day basis, you are sharing really the reasons why, like this sprint, like what is this sprint all about? And it could be a bunch of tasks, or it could be like, here's the problem we need to solve. And, and I think there's various time horizons for the problems that you're solving, but they should add up. And the thing that like irks me the most, honestly, is I think that Agile is great, better than Waterfall and anything that came before it, but Agile has a tendency to actually try to encourage both the product side and the engineering side to think of their roles in a very focused way, like we have blinders on. Because Agile kind of says, like, there's different roles. There's the product owner, there's the developers, and it encourages people to think in silos. In fact, Kanban, I think, is actually the worst thing for sharing problems versus solutions with developers. Because Kanban, like, literally says, like, the product manager is going to write on little sticky notes, like, a task and put a bunch of them up on the wall. And the developer, you're going to walk up and just, like, pick an arbitrary task and do a task. And when you're done with the task, put it in somewhere else. And it really just says, look, this is an assembly line, and you're just an assembly line worker. And so my biggest pet peeve about Agile is where it can tend to tell developers, and developers kind of allow this to happen, you're just a code monkey. You're just here to grind out code that the sticky note says to do, and you get to go home at 5, right? And I just think it would be so much better if Kanban was like a bunch of problems that we could solve for the customer. And actually every 2 weeks, the team kind of like studied the board of the possible problems you could be solving and like voted on the best one to solve or something like that, would be so much better. Any thoughts on how I think the team structure, as well as the way that a agile Scrum team operates, that actually can encourage or discourage sharing problems and really understanding why everyone's at work every day?
I like that a lot, actually. And I can completely agree that it's much easier to surface the problems in a natural, organic way when the teams are smaller, right? Because then by the nature of the beast, the teams end up being a bit more collaborative. So I guess there's a couple kind of follow-ups to that. One is, how do you, if a small team is a key to engaging software developers in the actual problem, right, to unlock their creativity and fundamental problem solving abilities, and frankly superpowers, then how do you ensure that as teams go through hyper growth phases, as products go through these hyper growth phases, and as companies grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger? Because I'm obviously a YouTube, which Google owns, massive company, rate year over year. And so how, and we're constantly asking for more headcount. We're constantly trying to grow the team as our product grows. And so that's sort of the first question. And then the second question is, if you're able to maintain small teams, do you think that there's actually...
Great question. So first of all, the problem of growing the team is a good one, because like every big idea starts small, like every team starts small, but if you succeed in business, chances are the scope grows, the team grows, and like that's called success. So it's a good thing. But then suddenly your nice small team where everyone was on the same page, executing really well, now your
Right.
team of 10 people is suddenly 50 people, and you're like, well, everything seems to fall apart. And so the answer to that, I believe, is this process, like it's like a mitosis type process where you continually divide and divide the team and the missions and the customers and all that stuff as you grow. And we've done this at Twilio quite a bit. So we started, I'll give you an example. Our first product was Twilio Voice. We let the developer, make and receive phone calls. And that started off with like me and my two co-founders built that product. And eventually we started to grow, and the team grew from the three of us to people we hired. It got to be 10 people, and then suddenly it was 20 people, right? And now suddenly things stopped working as well. And so what we did is we looked at the problem domain that problem was solving, and we said, okay, how could we divide this back down into two small teams? And we realized that really the product was comprised of two key pieces. One part was all these programmable APIs, and the other part was like connectivity into the carriers of the world. And at the beginning, they were all intertwined, like the code was all, mushed together into one giant thing. And so what we did is we just plotted the path. We said, okay, we're going to separate the code bases so that we're going to end up with not one service, but two microservices. One team's going to own one team's going to own the other. There's a very clear API between the two. And then there's a mission, the mission changes. And the mission for the team that had the APIs was, you're here to make really elegant, scalable, reliable, secure APIs. And then this team with the connectivity layer, your job is to interconnect this to every carrier in the world and make those super reliable and drive the costs down and all that kind of stuff. And so you took a team that had like one mission and they were kind of context switching a lot to two teams with two separate missions and an API between them. And then it took about 6 months to actually disentangle the two code bases, because there's no point in having two teams if it's one code base and they're just going to step all over each other. Right. So you and that's where you get and I actually think the current paradigms around microservices and all that actually came from the desire to have small teams. And so you use the technology, the team, and the mission, all kind of go together. And then you just keep doing that. And you keep subdividing and subdividing. And, the challenge at some point becomes, how do you convince a small team, let's say that in overall effort is like now 500 people and you've got 50 teams of 10 people. How do you make sure every one of those 50 teams still feels a lot of excitement and energy because they own smaller and smaller pieces? But actually the way you do that is by realizing that those pieces are now in and of themselves key drivers of the business, because you probably wouldn't staff them if they weren't. And so keep them focused. Okay, why do customers care about that part? Why do customers care about that part? And oftentimes you end up with new businesses as a result. So for example, when we divided the API from the connectivity, our product at that time was just the API. The connectivity was just kind of built in. The connectivity team that we created then realized that their product had independent value to customers. And so they productize it and they sell it. It's called SIP trunking. And now it's a large product of ours. And so you can kind of keep dividing, and oftentimes you realize that the way you divide the product results in actually new opportunities that you can go and tackle for customers.
I love that. Just as a quick follow-up, and then I would love to hear your take on the need for PMs. But just as a quick follow-up on that, do you think that notion is more applicable for B2B or B2C or B2B2C companies versus products and teams that are building directly for consumers?
I think that for B2C companies, it's easier for teams to connect what they're doing with why it matters, because chances are they use the product. So that's a benefit. It's a little harder for companies that are B2B companies, because usually the team members, like individually in their personal lives, aren't using the product. So it's a little less, you have a little less intrinsic understanding of what's going on and what needs to get done. But nonetheless, it can work the same way. And I don't think the breaking down of the problems really changes the nature of things, because even if you're, at like YouTube, like there's aspects of that site that are really important, either for the success of the site or for the happiness of the customers or for making more money or whatever the initiative is. And your job is just to instill in that team the sense of purpose of what they're doing and connect it to, ideally, to customers and then also to the company's success. And I think when you do that, people can get excited about a lot of things. Like for a period of time, I was really excited about people counters at this front door of a store. And I'm like, who would have ever thought about that? But that seemed important to me because I bought into the idea that this is an interesting problem that if I solve it will benefit my company and my employees and like all these other stakeholders. So.
Well, speaking of people who are excited, we have two of our both community leaders here on Fishbowl who have just joined us as speakers here, Alex Fursov and Lauren Brown, who have read your book, Jeff, and I think they did like it. I did promise, or did bring up two good Amazon reviews potentially at the end of tonight, so they might be able to provide. But they have some great questions, not only for you, but for the group as well. So I'll ask Alex and Lauren to sort of introduce themselves and the communities that they lead here on Fishbowl, and then they'll dive into the questions for Jeff, Namrata, and Erin.
Sure, I'll go first. Hi, everybody. It's very nice to virtually meet you guys. Jeff, I really enjoyed your book. And my name is Lauren Brown. I do lead the Black in Tech Bowl. I am an incoming PM at Microsoft, and I have a lot of questions about things that you have talked about, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Cool. So why don't we have you go with your first question, Lauren, and then we'll.
Sure. So I was formerly a data scientist. I guess I can always call myself a data scientist. And now I am transitioning into the PM role. And I read that you begin every onboarding session by telling the new hires you're a developer. And even in this conversation tonight, you started off by saying you did software development as well, too, instead of saying that you're the CEO as the introduction. So I wanted to know, why do you do this, and how does this help foster collaboration and I guess also a new relationship with your new hires at Twilio?
That's a great question. Why do I say that? Yeah, I think the reality is that there's certain activities that we do in life where that really kind of speaks to us as like almost a lifestyle. And that could be sports that we do, it could be hobbies that we have, and the things that we want to do that occupy our brain voluntarily, right? And I think a lot of developers actually feel that way about writing code. And that's why so many developers have like side projects. Like a lot of developers go home from their job at night and have a little thing they're hacking on. Maybe they contribute to an open source project. Maybe they've got a little startup that they've got in their head and they're thinking about. Being a developer feels like more than a profession, I think, to a lot of developers. Not all. Some developers are just, it's a profession. But a lot of developers almost see it more like a lifestyle. It's like a way of thinking. It's a certain type of tool that you use to like solve problems. And you can just see the world through the lens of software that could be built to go, kind of make someone's life better or increase, change some outcome. And so I think that's why a lot of developers really self-identify with this notion of like, I am a developer. Like people, I don't think are exactly the same with like, other professions necessarily, like accounting or dentistry. Like, like developers go home and practice new ideas for software at home at night. I don't think dentists like practice new ideas around dentistry on their family at night. At least I hope not. I don't live with a dentist and I hope they don't do that. But like developers are like that. And I think that also taps into like, why is it so important to get the full capabilities out of your developers by sharing problems, not solutions, by thinking of it as a creative field, is because there is a lot of that energy. Like developers really love the act of writing code and solving problems with software. I mean, again, I don't want to speak universally, but I think a lot of them do. And therefore, it's even more important that you extract that from them because they have so much more to give, most companies, than a lot of companies actually allow them to give.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that answer.
Hey guys, my name is Alex. I'm the community leader for the Data and Analytics Consultants Bowl as well as the General Tech Bowl. I worked as a data scientist at Oracle for a while, made my way up to a tech lead role by kind of pushing the boundaries, and I'm currently on sabbatical. The book really spoke to me because it talked a lot about the things that I wish some of my leadership was implementing a little bit more. So one of the things that you talk about, Jeff, is that it takes huge infrastructure commitment. We're looking at like 30%, 50% of the development budget going to it kind of thing. So apart from changing companies, what can developers at companies that don't necessarily make that much of an investment do? Right? What can developers at places that aren't as I guess, forward-looking as places like Twilio or Google or Facebook do for themselves?
I think it starts with handing them a copy of Ask Your Developer and opening it up to Chapter 11, the one about infrastructure. But there's a reason why I wanted to include the chapter about infrastructure, and it actually comes from personal experience, because there have been times at Twilio, like if you're a business person, like one of the biggest tools that you have is budget. And and of course, every company budgets tough every year, always. And there's always, and I've been in these conversations where we look at it and we're like, wait, look at this big chunk of money over here that we're spending on things that customers never actually perceive, right? It's like, our CI/CD pipelines, testing, notifying, monitoring, like all the platform stuff that companies do. And you're like, how do we squeeze that down? How do we spend less on that? And in fact, there's been times when we have done those things. But the thing that you have to realize is that when you don't invest in infrastructure, what you're doing is you're taking the rest of all your investment in R&D, like all the other engineers that you have on the team, and you're making them less productive. And so it's an ROI calculation. And look, you're not going to have the exact math to know exactly the ROI, but there are actually clever ways to measure the efficiency that teams are getting when you invest in infrastructure. In fact, it's a great way to hold your infrastructure teams accountable, because they have customers too. The customers of your infrastructure team are the rest of the development team. And success metrics there are, how easy is it to deploy code to prod? How many bugs were introduced or caught beforehand? What's the uptime? And like things like that they can influence with great infrastructure is a way to measure and also show the ROI, therefore, of the investments that you make in infrastructure. And so, like, for example, at Twilio, we measure number of deployments, the velocity of deployments. Is it necessarily the case that just deploying more is better? And could you do a deployment after every character you type? I mean, I guess. But like really the idea is, how hard or easy is it to get your code through the pipeline and into prod? And the easier it is, the more frequently your teams will deploy smaller changes, which, by the way, is safer. You tend to introduce less production outages when you make small deployments as opposed to fewer huge ones. And it shows that your pipeline and the infrastructure is very streamlined, so your developers are productive. And so there's things like that you can do that make the case to leaders that you need to invest more. And part of why I put in the book that it's pretty common for a lot of companies spend 50% of their R&D budget on this kind of stuff. Like, that's not unheard of, is to make the case that folks can do that. And the ROI is the efficiency factor of every other engineer on the team, as well as their ability to ship frequently and confidently. Because ultimately, that's what you need in order to have an iterative culture, be able to try a lot of things. If it takes you 6 months to deploy to prod, like, you can't iterate, you can't experiment. Like, you just kind of throw agility out the door. And so that's really the measures that investing in infrastructure gives you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you very much, Jeff. That makes sense. All about the metrics. Erin and Namrata, do you have any thoughts about this?
I do have one question, and that's more of a follow-up question. I think in terms of releasing smaller changes in the productions and testing smaller changes. So, Jeff, in the book, you talk a lot about experimentation and how experimentation is prerequisite to innovation. I want to kind of hear your thoughts more on that, and how can more companies foster more experimentation?
I think it's funny. Thank you for the question, right? If you talk to business leaders, like, what business leaders wouldn't say they want more innovation? Like, that's like, the chronic buzzword of every leader ever, right? We want more innovation, right? Of course you do. Mm-hmm. But then unintentionally, business leaders punish people for doing the acts that result in innovation. And by that, I mean, like, there's some new idea that people get excited about, and you say, oh, okay, oh my God, we got this crazy idea. Let's go. We're going to staff a team, go. And then you check in with them 6 months later, and it's like, hey, how come this isn't a huge business yet? They're like, we're just getting started, blah, blah, blah. And people are really impatient, and they lose focus. And then they end up punishing those teams, not punishing like literally, but like they kind of get shunned, they don't get budget, they stop paying attention to them, or maybe the team gets disbanded, all that kind of stuff. And so what you really need, if you want a culture of innovation, is you need to have a culture that honors, respects, and implements the process whereby innovation occurs. And to me, that is trying lots of things. Mm-hmm. Because nobody knows which idea is ultimately going to be the next big one. Therefore, the way to find out is to try and iterate a lot. And the other thing that, like, let's say a team goes away and with a mission to build X for such and such a customer, and they come back 6 months later and it's like, okay, well, it didn't work. Customers didn't want it. Typically, that team is looked at as having failed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Oh, like you didn't succeed in building a large business or even getting the small business off the ground, and they're kind of shunned. When instead you should look at that team and celebrate them for figuring out relatively quickly and inexpensively something that customers don't want. And that knowledge is useful. Finding out something that doesn't work is also additive to the collective knowledge of the company.
Mm-hmm.
And you compare that with the example of the company where somebody says, hey, we got this big idea. Okay, great. We're going to put $20 million behind it. And we're going to spend 2 years and we're going to buy a Super Bowl ad and launch it. And then you find out customers don't want it. Right?
Yeah.
The people who found out that same piece of information in like 2 months for an investment of like $20,000, they're heroes. Like they should be paraded through the streets, right?
Yeah, that's such a great point, Jeff. I think there are, it's such a simple point in terms of embracing failures and figuring out something that doesn't work faster. Fail fast is so important, but there are so many companies who just miss out on this simple point, right? I mean, failure for them is kind of penalizing the team that failed.
And the key thing, like I actually knock the fetishization of failure a little bit. Like I think Silicon Valley is a little too focused on failure to the extent it's almost comical, right? But I do think what you like, failure is bad. Let's just say it. Like failure is not fun. Human beings don't like to fail. We don't really want to fail. But the whole equation has changed if you move it from this team is here to like build a thing that makes $100 million. If you move it from that, is this team is here to experiment quickly to prove or disprove hypotheses about something the company could do. Because in that world, if they're running a hypothesis, let's say the hypothesis is customers want X, and you go and very quickly run that hypothesis and you find out that customers do not want X. That is a successful experiment. An experiment that's designed to prove or disprove a hypothesis is successful when it proves or disproves a hypothesis. So that is not failure, that is a successful experiment. The only failure mode of an experiment is where a lot of time and money go by and you never proved or disproved the hypothesis. Like that's a failed experiment.
Right.
If you spend like years and lots of money and at the end of it, you still don't know what customers want, that's the only failure mode of an experiment. And so in fact, the faster you get to the prove or disprove, that's the more successful the experiment is. And so it's not a matter of disproving equals failure. It's a matter of actually you've changed the equation from I'm looking for a business outcome to I'm looking at an experimental outcome.
I like that framework a lot. As someone who's at a larger company, it sort of gets to the notion of the innovator's dilemma, which is, many times companies, when they get so big, they don't have the right structures in place to incentivize employees to do these kinds of experiments, right? Because like the people who get promoted and who are rewarded are the people who are not failing often and they're not failing a lot. And so I would love your sort of thoughts on that point, Jeff. Like, how do you think about and I would say I would extend it even to experiments, right? Like if there's a team at large companies that where all they do is sort of experiment and they have a large velocity of learnings, but those learnings don't necessarily equate to massive impact on the business's bottom line because the business is so large. How would you think about that?
And you're absolutely right. Like you can take it to the opposite extreme, which is we ran a lot of experiments and we learned a lot of things and we wrote them all down and now here we are, right? And so the way you do it, like the way I tend to think about it is a team comes to you or you come to them with an idea for, say, a product that you might build. And typically before you fund it, you would put together a model that says like, here's what we think might happen. Like, and it's a spreadsheet that says, we think we're going to have 1,000 customers, each paying us $1,000 a month. Therefore, we're going to have $1 million a month in like 3 years' time. Whatever. You've made up numbers, right? And by the way, a lot of this, I can't take credit for a lot of this. This is Eric Ries and the Brilliance of the Lean Startup, by the way, is where I got a lot of this stuff. I want to give credit where credit's due. And basically, the way he looks at it is he says, Like you've got this spreadsheet and all the numbers in it are just made up. And so every one of those assumptions in there is a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis that a customer is willing to pay you $1,000 a month for this product. It's a hypothesis that there are 1,000 such customers in the world that within 2 years' time you could get on board. And now your job is to go test those hypotheses. And so you see, you aren't testing hypotheses for the sake of hypotheses. You're testing them in this context of building a successful product. And so if the team can't move from, great, we tested the hypothesis, we figured out that there's customers are willing to pay $1,000 a month, and they don't turn it into, okay, great, now let's go build said product. Or if you prove your hypotheses seem to be correct, then your job is to go obviously build that product and actually take the hypotheses that you prove true and turn them into business reality. And so that's where I'd say rubber meets the road of actually building a successful business.
Love that. That's a great way to.
The other thing that I would say is it can be hard for a team or a leader inside of a big company that doesn't act this way to independently act this way. Now you could do it with your teams, but if the executives that you report to are still looking at it the other way, it's hard. That's why this book is kind of written a lot for executives to try to give them a different way of thinking about their the way they drive the business. Everybody says they want innovation, but if you punish people for doing the innovation process, which is experimentation, you're not going to get innovation.
That was really good questions from our panel. I have one more that I wanted to ask, especially as a new incoming PM to a large company like Microsoft. I wanted to know, what is the best thing that business leaders and CEOs can learn from developers, and vice versa? What can developers learn from business leaders and CEOs? What do they want us all to know?
Interesting. That's a good question. I would say, let me see, which one of those should I take first? What should developers learn from business people? Because with developers, there's often the pointy-haired boss, the old Dilbert thing, where it's oh, they don't get it, right? And a lot of times the business people don't get it because they don't know what goes on in the act of build.
Jeff, you're muted.
Yeah, I know. It's okay. So why don't we route that over to Namrata or Erin?
I've got a question for Erin.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So these days, it's pretty common for engineers to prep for whiteboarding interviews very explicitly, kind of drilling these things for a long time, sometimes for months. In your time working with engineers, have any of you guys noticed any kind of trends from this, I guess for lack of a better word, commoditization of tech interviews?
That's a good question. I am actually not a huge fan of the whiteboard tech interview, and this may be a contrarian point of view. I think it's in a lot of ways not representative of how engineers actually work or developers actually work on a day-to-day basis, especially at large companies. This may be different at earlier stage companies, but at large companies, it's really about the most productive developers are really just integrating code into a very large code base and doing a lot of troubleshooting and debugging. And so I actually find that that a better set of interviews is just diving into code and not even writing some complex algorithm or data structure to solve a weird abstract problem. How do you do depth first or breadth first search, and when do you employ each? Those sort of questions just I don't think are as useful, because that's not really how engineers work on a day-to-day basis. So that's potentially a contrarian point of view. And so I've actually kind of taken on an effort at Google to change the way that we interview, and I'm sort of trying to push a couple things where what actually happens within a tech interview is the engineer might look at might be assigned a bug and look at a very large, code base, and then kind of need to figure out why it's broken or why some things aren't working, which is really kind of how this plays out more applicably on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I feel like a lot of folks in our community share that opinion with you right there.
Yeah, just to add to that, I totally agree with Erin, and I think just one quick point I would add is that just doing real world problem solving and pair programming is kind of more effective than whiteboard coding interviews.
And running an organization that is effectively developer bootcamp, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but would you say that these kind of prep institutions are taking note that the industry is starting to wake up to this?
Yeah, I mean there are many tech companies who are already kind of abandoned whiteboard coding interviews. I used to work at Coinbase. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
He has.
I don't know when you guys stopped hearing me.
All good. So Namrata was just about to dive into an answer here, and then we'll have you jump back in.
Yeah, I was just wrapping up. I was just mentioning, Alex, that yes, many companies are rising to that, and they have abandoned whiteboarding coding interviews. Coinbase is a perfect example where we in favor of pair programming interviews, we removed kind of the whiteboard coding questions, and that worked really well in hiring and growing the team pretty quickly, and at the same time kind of hiring engineers who has real world programming experience than an abstract problem solving experience.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. Whiteboard's going away. Goodbye, leak code.
Actually, I would love to get Jeff's thoughts on that as not only a developer but the leader of very engineering, as the leader for an organization that's like primarily marketed towards engineers. I remember when you all went public and someone asked you all, like, what do you do? And you said, I only care if your developer knows what I do. So what do you think about sort of these whiteboarding interviews, Jeff, and whether or not they are sort of effective at evaluating talent? And I will also add a fair way to identify people you want to hire.
Well, I would say I am not an expert in this. I haven't done a technical interview in a long time, either on the interviewee or interviewer side. So, and I know that a lot of folks feel that like putting you on the spot and not being able to Google the answer, which yes, we all know that like as developers, we're Googling everything all the time to figure out like how some API works or how some language construct works, that not being able to do that is not fair. So that's totally legitimate. But I do think like actually seeing how you think is an important thing. So I think to the extent you ask someone a problem and you want to see how they think on their feet, and the way they think, the thought process they go through, I think that is, a reasonable way to try to understand how a person would act in a business context, how they would think on their feet. Because like we have to like interact with each other, with other human beings a lot. And that act is one of kind of thinking on your feet and being a good communicator. And so if you're simulating that process, which is something we do have to do in the world of business, even as developers, that's good. If it's trying to put you on the spot and see if you know the details of like some obscure Python API, that's not useful. So that's the way I would think about it. But again, I haven't studied this idea deeply, and I have not performed nor been a part of a technical interview in a long time.